The title of this message is In the Age of Confusion and Evil. In the Age of Confusion and Evil. Some of the things I'm going to read may sound like they are on topic, but I think we'll pull it all together and hopefully it'll make sense. In the age of confusion and evil, one of the keys to understanding the New Testament is realizing that the church was considered a sect, S-E-C-T, S-E-C-T, a sect within Judaism. And they considered themselves a sect within Judaism, the sect that were the true Jews worshiping correctly. You can go to Revelation 3, 9, and 10, and you'll see, one of the last book written in the New Testament canon says that Christians are the true Jews. And anyway, that's there. The question is, how did all this happen? And what does it mean? Because understanding the truth with more clarity will help us stay on point. And we were saying in the podcast last night, I know it sounds audacious, but we said we are more important than we think we are. 'Cause I realize as small as we are, everybody would chuckle. But maintaining the truth as well as we can is important. I'll bet you the devil has us on his radar. You're probably thinking, no, not really. He's got bigger fish to fry, admittedly, and he's frying them, but keeping the truth is an important thing, and who knows what will happen down the road. I'm going to go to Acts 11, 25 to 27. The background is the church only, the apostles only preached to Jews and proselytes who came to Judaism. And there were a few exceptions where God's Spirit forced the issue, but the Christian leaders, Peter and the others, didn't do that. But they moved further north into what's now Syria to a city called Antioch. And in Antioch, something different happened. Some of the Jewish people, not most of them, but a few, decided to speak to the Greeks and the Romans that were in the area, and they were shocked. God called a large number of, I'll use the term, raw Gentiles into the church. So I'm going to read the background a little bit and show you how this all fits in. Acts 11, 25. Then Barnabas departed for Tarsus to seek Saul. When he had found him, he brought him to Antioch, so that it was for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people. Now, this became a big church. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. And in these days, the prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch, kind of to see what was going on. Now, you're going to say, well, what were they called the 20 years prior to that? For almost 20 years, they were just considered a sect within Judaism. They were probably considered Jews who believed in Jesus of Nazareth, but they were still considered Jews. And here's what I believe is the most logical explanation. It was the Gentiles of Antioch that noticed a difference between the Christians and the other Jews. And I don't think it was a doctrinal thing, because the Bible was pretty much only read in the synagogue. Books didn't exist in those days. And the Gentiles wouldn't get into doctrinal differences between various sects within Judaism, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. And actually, there was even some divisions within the Pharisees and the Essenes. Gentiles wouldn't get involved in that sort of thing. They could care less and wouldn't even know about it. What they saw was that the Christians were different. How were they different? They were different because they had more love. Now, obviously, that's because they were filled with the Holy Spirit, and they had loving people like Barnabas teaching them. Barnabas doesn't get a lot of credit in the New Testament, but when Paul first showed up, he was the only one of the apostles that would talk to him. The others said, it's a trick. He's trying to trap us so we could be arrested. And Barnabas, he just had that kind of openness, loving, accepting warmth. He took Paul in, And then later, when he had all those Gentiles, he brought Paul from his hometown to Antioch, because Paul grew up in a Gentile city. We believe went to what's equivalent of a Gentile college, and Paul knew that material as well as the Hebrew material, the Bible material. So he brought Paul as someone they could use in Antioch. But Barnabas gave them, and others too, and the Holy Spirit gave them love. They accepted the Gentiles in a way that the other Jews wouldn't. And the Jews started noticing a difference, and they called these people little Christ. They may not always have meant that as a compliment, but the Christians took it that way. And that is a great compliment. They saw something in them they didn't see in the others. And of course, the big challenge for us in an age of confusion and evil, we need to be lights to the world. But it's harder now because everything is confused. There's so many churches and there's so many charities. And let's say it's harder to be a light than it was. In those days, you had raw Gentiles and raw paganism versus mostly true Christians. So it wasn't so hard. Now it's a lot harder. But we still have to strive for that Christian love that the people in Antioch saw. And I'll just read Revelation 3:9. You all know the verse, but I'll read it. Indeed, I'll make those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not. What we think is that this is like 92 to 95 AD. By that time, there were false apostles who had pulled away brethren to themselves and created false synagogues, or if you like the term, false churches. And but lie indeed. I'll make them come and worship before your feet and know that I've loved you, and that they are the real Jews, that is the true church of God. Right now, we see the world dissolving around us. Big urban areas like Chicago are falling apart. I'm giving my opinion. I might mention this, I was blessed. I guess it's just the way things worked out. I got to be an executive at Sears headquarters. And if I'd stayed, would have had an office on the 49th floor of the Sears Tower. Do you realize that what's called the Miracle Mile downtown Chicago was some people thought it was the second Broadway. You can maybe debate that, but it was a big deal. Well, this past weekend, it appears it was coordinated with social media. Caravans of cars took thugs, and I guess there were some of the BLM, Antifa, anarchists with them as well. And they smashed into Miracle Mile, looted many of the stores, like Macy's. And I think Macy's says they're not coming back to Chicago. Maybe it'll vary with different stores. And they just, and you're going to say, how is stealing Gucci's help civil rights movements? You're asking the wrong question. They actually feel righteous in what they're doing. And you're going to say, this doesn't make any sense. But for the first time, at least that I recall, the mayor and the police chief of Chicago were shocked. This is beyond what they expected. They expect, a certain amount of riot and looting, and it's all for the greater cause of, at least what they think is a greater cause of bringing about Marxism to America, whatever. But I think they realized, wait a minute, the great city of Chicago might never recover from this. I'm not saying I know what the future holds, but it is possible the great city of Minneapolis may not recover from what happened to it. And if this keeps going on, the great city of Chicago, right here in the great state of Illinois, may not recover. It's like evil is starting to get out of control. Like if you start a fire, but can you keep it under control? Can you keep it in the campground, with a little brick circle? At the end of the New Testament canon, the church was making its breakout to the outside world. And the question is, what can we do as we look toward the future? Obviously, we want to let our light shine in two areas, both in our behavior and maintaining the truth. Both of those are going to be harder. I think they're both going to be harder because the devil has masked his activities in confusion. It's like you take a giant bowl of water and you got marbles in it, fine, and you throw a bunch of mud in there and you stir it up, so it's hard to find the valuable marbles in this mud bowl. Let me give you a military example. One of the big secrets of World War II is where and when the Allies would open up the Western Front by invading France. Actually, Churchill wanted a totally different one, but that's another story, what he wanted. But America cared the day we were in charge, so it was going to be in Normandy. Well, a German spy actually discovered the truth. And at the last minute, the British found out, and he got into the embassy in Turkey with the evidence. Well, the British picked him up in an obvious way to make it look like he was working for the British. But they said, well, what we have to do is confuse the Germans. The British were very good at spying. You know, some of that James Bond stuff, according to the author, was based on some real British agents. Anyway, the British sent 11 credible spy messages to Germany to confuse them about which one was right. Even one, a sailor died. They had a submarine drop his body off near a German beach with the Allied plans in his back pocket and a plastic cover. So if the Germans recovered the body, they would think they got a great secret by a ship that was sunk. And it worked. They actually sent twice as many reconnaissance planes over the false location, straight across the bay, than over the real. So if the Germans were counting surveillance airplanes, they got misleading information. I think that's what the devil does. He sends so much mess out there in so many different areas, you're confused about what is true, what is not true, what is good, what is not good. I believe this to be true. When Ronald Reagan and others that helped him, Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul, when they brought down communism and it collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiency, it almost collapsed in China too. They fought it off in Tiananmen Square, and I'm told by students they had really big battles in Beijing that the general public didn't see. The communists barely survived in China, and they decided to be more capitalist to save communism in China. Although communism is still threatened in China, and there are people who are predicting it will fall, especially if Trump gets reelected and keeps putting trade pressure on them long term. They're working hard to see to it he doesn't get reelected. And they're doing it openly, in case you think I'm making this up. But we thought the communism was over, but I'm saying the devil is really behind evil movements like that. And the devil said, well, okay, we didn't win up front, out in the front. He kind of dispersed his forces, and they infected schools of theology, the environmental movement, and others. And I was listening this morning to a guy who wrote a book. I won't go into all the details, but he talks about how through theology seminaries, this member of the Communist Party, actually at a public speech, actually said, we have church pastors who are actually secret members of the Communist Party. They're really secularists. They don't really believe in a real Jesus Christ or real second coming. And they're going to move their denominations further and further to the left. And he gave examples of how they have achieved that. And they're changing the definition of good and evil. You see it in front of your eyes. Obviously, they're involved in politics. Some would say one of our political parties has been 80, 90% taken over by them. Now, they're not going to tell the public that. You know, it's a little smarter to not say it so openly. So the definition of goodness and rightness. For instance, there are a lot of young people come out of college and they say, I'm a social justice warrior. Woo! And they think they're doing good things. And they believe in something called the racial, I'll probably get the name wrong, division theory. But if I got the theory name wrong, and basically, they're going to create a utopian America by pushing left-wing ideas, and they're willing, the warrior word is important, they're willing to fight for it. And it includes a lot of women. A lot of these people demonstrating for Antifa are young women. You don't think of young women, I mean, I don't think of it, out there breaking big store windows and looting. But I actually saw it, especially in Portland. And you can tell that they're women, even with all the costumes and masks. And most of them have been to college. These are not criminals in the normal, I mean, there are a lot of criminals with them. They use the criminal element. And the criminal element is glad to get in there and loot and steal Gucci's and $200 tennis shoes and flat screen TVs. But they're using the criminals and the thugs. But a lot of them actually believe they're righteous. They're social justice warriors. And it sounds good. And the guy explained, he showed how they infiltrated one church denomination, led them to the left. He said there was a relatively small group of leaders who got top positions that were secretly communist. And I would argue that's probably true in a lot of areas in society. Those men were using other people who thought they were doing the right thing. But you know who was using them? You know who was using them? Satan. Now, they don't know that. Although there is some evidence that Karl Marx actually was into the occult and dealt with the devil. But that's a little bit debatable, depends on which author you go to. But at least in most cases, they probably think they're doing the right thing. And it's interesting to note that Stalin was trained in a seminary to be a priest. That's where he learned how to turn people against each other, because he got that from the priests and how they controlled the young men. And of course, there he decided he wanted to be a communist and left the priesthood, or his chance to be in the priesthood, and became a communist leader. And that general, by the way, Hitler was also a socialist, National Socialist Party. It's just that they and the communists were rivals in the same area, because everybody thinks the fascists and Nazis are on the right and the communists on the left. No, they were both on the left. Hitler was for big government control as well. They just did it differently. They were rivals, and sometimes rivals in the same area hate each other greatly. Like there are some Muslim rivals, you know, the Shiites and the others, they hate each other. You know what I'm saying. So there are similarities in that area. Also, Karl Marx was born Jewish. His dad converted to Christianity, and he was in a very religious town and supposedly was religious early in his life, but obviously he switched to secularism. You see a connection there. The devil uses, I'll call it, religion, and if he can get some false religious leaders, they're very effective. And you just see that when you study history. But they don't really believe in the real Jesus. By the way, there are quite a few people coming out of seminaries that are preaching in churches that do not believe in the real, literal second coming of Jesus Christ. They kind of have a vague belief in God and Christ, or you can get to heaven by a whole number of ways. That way, by the way, is not scriptural. There's only one way, and that's Jesus Christ. And anyway. But communism is a religion. It's a secularism, but it is a religion. It's state worship. And what they want is power. And I'll just give you the cores of communism and socialism. Abolish private property. Then the government is in charge of property. Do you realize if you're running the government, that makes you richer and more powerful? Actually, Stalin bragged to his mother. She said, "What are you actually doing now?" Once he got to be head of the Communist Party. He says, "I'm sort of like the Tsar, but with more power," which was actually true, and more cruelty, a whole lot more cruelty. They abolished guns except for their own secret police. They did it in Venezuela, they did it in Nazi Germany, they did it in the Soviet Union. You can see why you do that, wouldn't you? If the people don't like something you're doing, if they're unarmed and you're thugs, and Boy, if you read the history of that, actually they started off with the Cheka. They had black leather jackets, and actually Lenin and Stalin both said we have to use terror. Actually, they got that concept from the French Revolution. Robespierre and the French Revolution actually said to get what we want, it has to be a certain amount of terror. Now, they used the guillotine, but the principle's there. He's the one that came up with a famous expression that was quoted by, I think, Bernard Shaw and many others. To make a great omelet, you have to break a few eggs, meaning, and actually, Karl Marx and Engels did say in their book that some despotism at first will be necessary to force everybody to give up their private property and do whatever we want them to do, to create this socialist paradise. It just never worked that way. And they also want to abolish God, at least the God in the concept that we know. So when they were defeated in 1989, 1990, it kind of like a disease that metastasized and spread into other areas. It got into higher education, in the seminaries, in the media, in Hollywood. And now it's starting to shine. They control the media, Hollywood. And you might wonder, someone was talking to me about why when Republicans put in Supreme Court justices, they often let them down. My theory is, besides the devil's influence is probably a factor too, is law schools are very, very liberal. So you'll notice when you watch Supreme Court justices, the ones appointed on the left, they almost always vote far, far, far left. It's rare they're voting otherwise. But the ones on the right tend to drift left and often let us down. If you study, you'll see what I mean. So law schools are also that way. And maybe some of the threats that liberals make have influenced some of our judges as well. Bad influences are everywhere. So it's harder for us to shine and to obey God because all the bad influences are on us too, right? The people you meet, all your TV stars, and a lot of the books you read. I've gotten, somewhat to the point where I prefer older science fiction books and older novels because they had less mess in them, if you know what I mean. The new ones, it may be a great story, but they always want to put bad words in there, sexual perversion in there. You read some of the books, you'll see what I mean. The new ones, it's like they gotta dirty up everything. Does that make sense? And they sneak it on you. You think, well, what is this? This story didn't need to have that in there, but they put it in there anyway. And so there were two things that identified Jews and would have identified the true church too in its early days: circumcision and the seventh-day Sabbath. Neither were changed, but they made an exception for adult Gentiles. And it's really logical. All the Jews would have been circumcised as a baby, so it was no big deal. They don't even remember it, no big deal. But for Gentiles, it was like a forbidden door that would keep most of them out. And the Judaizing party liked it that way. They wanted the church to remain mostly Jewish. That was not God's will, so he made that exception. That unnecessary barrier. And it was a big controversy. Read Acts 15, and even when they lost that meeting and the church made the right decision to exempt adult Gentiles from all that, it was still an issue. You'll see it throughout the New Testament. But you'll notice the New Testament is silent about any change of the Sabbath. It's just totally silent. And you realize the Sabbath is in the heart of the Ten Commandments. If they had dared change that, wouldn't it have been a big controversy? Wouldn't the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and all those other groups mentioned, they'd be throwing that epithet at Paul and the others all the time. But it's never mentioned. And here's the reason, but it's not defended in the New Testament so much. The reason it's not defended, they took it for granted. They all would go to the synagogue, and I think they had certain readings maybe twice a year they go through every book in the Bible just about. Maybe they might have exempted the Song of Solomon or something like that. But so they heard this sort of thing read frequently, and they all knew it, and it wasn't controversial. Now maybe some of the excess regulations of the Sabbath Christ criticized, but that's more of an administrative thing. They never, in other words, it was never an issue. That's why they never talked about it. It's sort of like murder. There's nobody that's going to, well, let's write a long letter to the church telling why they shouldn't murder people. Well, nobody's going to think that. It's just, nobody would think it. It wouldn't be necessary. But here's why the Sabbath is important. It's one of the things that worldwide altered. They first went to Saturday, Sunday, and then all the Sunday when they apostatized. So we have to stay true. Exodus 31:17. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. And then he just says the 6-day Sabbath is a sign between God and his people. It tells you which God you worship. Luke 4:14-16. As far as the Bible is concerned, Christ kept the Sabbath his entire life, and so did the 12 apostles. Luke 4:14. Then Jesus returned in power of the Spirit to Galilee. He took the challenge of Satan. The news of him went throughout all the surrounding regions, and he taught in the synagogues, being glorified by all. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, as his custom was. As his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. When you read the context, we think this is the message he began his ministry with. He turned to the page in Isaiah that referred to him. This is a day of salvation, and he said, that scripture is about me. I'm Jesus, am the Messiah. It kind of shocked his hometown audience. What? That was his message. And when did he give it? On the Sabbath, that he was the Messiah. Where did Paul go to find Christians? Because later when he was defending himself before all the Jews, and he's telling them all about what he's done, his background, Acts 22:19. Where did Paul go to find Christians? And when did he find them? Where? Acts 22:19. So I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue, I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I was standing by, consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. So Paul found the Christians in the synagogue on the Sabbath. That's where he found them. Don't let the world confuse you on the Sabbath. It's God's sign. There are actually politicians who are confusing people about when it's appropriate to use violence and demonizing the police. You realize that when I think it was the governor of New York said, who says that all protests have to be peaceful? That's just throwing red meat to the anarchists and the thugs and criminals. And when you demonize the police, they call it the Ferguson effect. What are the police going to do? They're going to back off. They're going to take less chances in chasing down criminals. When you think about it, you'll see, what do you think is going to happen? Crime and disorder will explode. And you see that in big cities run by Democratic mayors. There may be an exception or two somewhere else, but that's pretty much the case. And the mixed up younger generation, I got a right to do this. They kind of think that. And many of the Antifa people who are, if you look at what they're doing to the federal courthouse out in Portland, you see a military precision. They pack in tight, so the police don't know who threw the Molotov cocktail and who threw the brick. And they back away, hands up, like, we want you police to overreact. You can see it's like discipline if you watch them. And they're well armed with gas masks, helmets, and big heavy clubs and other incendiary devices. And you can see it may look like it's all disorder and it's just an emotional reaction. And some mayors say, it's only because they're federal police guarding the court. If the feds weren't there, the kids would be mild. The feds weren't there for like a bunch of days, and they almost burned the place down with people inside of it, by the way. the feds had to beef up their guards, or Trump said, no, we're not going to let them burn down any federal courthouse or tear down any more federal statues. And anyway, they believe they're right. It's not, I know there are some thugs who are just out there to get what they can get, and they get all riled up and probably high on dope. But a lot of them are disciplined, somewhat badly educated young people who believe they're doing the right thing. And when you look at them in Portland, you can see the discipline. They got a strategy. We tease the police. We go back. We throw some more Molotov cocktails. We pull back. And we'll just wear the police down until we, and I think they've attacked a police precinct in Portland, and the police held the line. They didn't get it, but they may try again. I think they attacked a couple other places in Oregon. I'm going to read this joke, and if this joke offends you, you can tell Natalie, and she'll get on my case later. In this joke, it's really a short joke. There's the governor of Illinois and the mayor of Chicago, and they say, we need to remind those of you who will be out this weekend shooting in Chicago the importance of wearing a mask in order to keep yourself and others safe. Now, I know you say, the mayor didn't actually say that, but it almost sounds like that. It almost sounds that bad. We shall see how it goes. There was right and wrong are kind of all confused. And, at least between now and the election, it will probably get worse. And Carl tells me they're going to kind of gunk up this election to make the after the election period kind of questionable. We don't know who won. All the mail-in ballots aren't out there. And it would be tragic. I mean, it would be funny if it weren't tragic. But government officials are kind of giving a pass to people who are doing bad things. Right and wrong is blurred, and it's harder to be a good witness in this atmosphere. Well, let's go back to Barnabas and the church in the book of Acts. Acts 11, 20, 21. But there were certain of them, Cyprians and Syrians, who entered the Antioch and spoke to the Greeks, and basically started converting Greeks. It says, and a great number believed. In other words, God opened up a lot of minds of a lot of Gentiles to come into the church. Verse 23 and 24 kind of focus on the apostle Barnabas, who having arrived and seeing the grace of God, rejoiced and exhorted all with purpose of heart to abide with the Lord. For he, meaning Barnabas, was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith. And a large crowd of people were added to the church because of Barnabas being full of the Spirit. And I think the Gentiles saw that spirit in the Christians and their love, and that they didn't see in the other Jews, and that's why they started to see the two as separate groups. And this is our battle. How can we stand out in a world where it's even more confusing? Because you look at environmentalism. Well, it's nice to protect the environment. Nobody would be against that. But they use it, and they go to the point of it's animal worship, it's nature worship, it's tree worship. I mean, they don't say that, but that's how far they go. I've even seen stories where this tree is worth more than a child's life. I thought, what? You're kidding me. I'm not making that up. This is how crazy some of them have gotten. Or baby seals are worth more than human babies. They don't mind killing human babies in the womb, but you can't mess with these animals in nature. You're going to say, what? Animal babies are worth more than human babies? I'm not making this up. If you read the stuff they've written, that's how bad it's gotten. But it's confusing because it sounds good. You want to take care of nature, and the people are bad, and there are too many people in the world. That also, they say, might justify if they have to liquidate some stubborn nonconformists. The world has too many people anyway. Some of them actually believe that. And they say, we have to get rid of some people. It might be good for the planet. This is crazy talk. But that's what actually exists out there in the far left. Luke 6:44. And this is the part that we have to think about a little bit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorns, and grape vintage from a bramble. The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good. And our battle, and maybe our toughest battle, is protecting our heart and our mind. The world will try to confuse you and or influence you to accept more and more evil. It's our heart and our mind that the devil's after. And I would have to say, looking at the country as a whole, boy, the devil is doing quite well this night. You can see it. Out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and the wicked man out of the wickedness of his heart brings forth wicked. For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. Our goal is to be a positive influence, just like the church in Antioch. We have to guard our heart, guard our mind. Satan wants to confuse and pollute our heart. And a lot of entertainment has Marxism behind it, subtly, very clearly. A lot of it is anti-God. Even some of the anti-patriotism, anti-God is moving into sports. I see it. There are words in the Star Spangled Banner and maybe some of the other pledges of allegiance that mention God. You can see certain sports figures or young men that came out of these colleges that don't know anything. Just because someone's a 23-year-old star quarterback or running back doesn't mean he knows anything about anything. Or star baseball player, hockey player, movie star, or he's a TV star because he has great hair, but he doesn't know anything. So we have to resist the cloud of confusion. Stay pure, stay clear. All 10 commandments are righteousness. All are in effect. God is not going to change any of them, no matter what the world says. And that includes the fourth one. Well, let's look at reasons to question the fourth commandment. One is the resurrection of Christ. I'm going to read John 20:1-2. Most of you know this, but I'm just going to go through it fairly quickly. You can get it in your notes in case someone tries to confuse you about the Sabbath. You'll know this. John 20:1-2. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, while it was still dark. If the sun rises roughly about 6 a.m. in the Middle East, maybe she came at 5 a.m., 5:30, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And by the way, reading the other versions, they looked inside. An angel told them he's not here, he's gone, and they could see for themselves he wasn't there. Maybe they didn't understand everything quite at first, but they clearly saw he wasn't there. And so she went and told Simon, Peter, and the others, Jesus is not in his tomb. He's not in his tomb. And they ran out. I think John actually outran Peter to get there because he was a little bit younger, and he wasn't there. So this idea that he rose on Sunday morning with the rising sun is not true. He was gone. And because of the sign of Jonah, the 72 hours, 3 days and 3 nights, we believe he was resurrected at the end of the Sabbath, which would be exactly 3 days and 3 nights from when he went in, because they got him in the grave quickly before the sun set, if you remember the story. So, but one thing, nobody saw him rise Sunday morning, when you put all the things together. Also, there's one more reason Christ was there the day after the Sabbath. It's called the wave sheaf offering. It was the Sabbath is bracketed by the days of unleavened bread. After that Sabbath, the workers in Israel would get a big sheaf of the first of the harvest of oats and barley, and they would bring it to the high priest. And they had a little ceremony, and since the high priest represented God and the temple his throne, they would present it to God. Then they could eat the fruit after the first fruits had been blessed and accepted by God. You realize everything that happened in the temple is really a model of God's plan. Who was the real first of the first fruits? It was Jesus Christ. He is the real wave sheaf offering. The day after the Sabbath was his day. John 20:17. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father, your father, and to my God, your God. In other words, he limited any touching of him until he had been presented as the first of the first fruits. Then he came back down. Well, there are two other reasons people give for altering the Sabbath. I'm going to go through them quickly. One is 1 Corinthians 16:2. 1 Corinthians 16:2. On the first day of the week, let each of you lay something aside, storing up. Now, this storing up is not putting a dollar bill in the basket, storing up, as he may prosper, that there be no collection when I come. Now, the saints were starving in Judea, and actually they didn't need so much money. When there's a real famine, money and gold aren't worth so much. It's food people need. Food, oil, wine. They were storing up various kinds of produce, probably salted meat. Anyway, the verse right in front of you tells you what it's about. Now, concerning the collection for the saints. So why were they storing up produce each Sunday? For the collection of the saints. And I've given order to the church of Galatia, so you must do also. And you'll see throughout both books of Corinth and many of the other books, Paul is playing the different congregations as a rivalry to see which one can have the most available. When this caravan comes through, they will, I guess, in all the different farms and wherever they'll have already collected barrels of oil and wine and beans and grain and whatever, all that other produce that was available that could be preserved and shipped. And they put it in wagons, and they were going to ship it to the Middle East. And he didn't want them to have to do all the work. It'd be sort of like if you had a canned goods drive or a clothing drive, you probably would do it on the first day of the week. You wouldn't do it on the Sabbath. It'd be too much work, too messy if you think about it. So that's what that's all about. Okay, there's one more reason people think that maybe the Sabbath was changed. It's Acts 20, verse 7 and 8. Acts 20, 7 and 8. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day. That's the key verse. Ready to depart the next day. Spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. In other words, it was actually a Saturday night going away dinner for Paul. If you read the verses before that, they thought this was the last time they would ever see Paul. He was very dear as their mentor. Actually, with tears, they cried over Paul. We don't know for sure if they ever saw Paul again. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. It's not written in the book of Acts. So if you had Paul, who was a founder of your church and really did great things and sacrificed, he said, I'm going to Jerusalem to meet my fate. And, there are people saying he was going to die in Jerusalem. He said, I don't care. I'm going to witness to the Jews. It's my goal. And then go to Rome. And actually, it all worked out for Paul, at least for a while, that way. But they didn't know if they'd ever see him again. So this was a going away party for Paul. Let's say they collected at 6, maybe they ate dinner at 7, and then Paul probably started speaking at 8, and he spoke till midnight. And maybe some other people did a little bit too. But Paul probably wanted to get in as much as he could before he was gone. This is not a change of a commandment. This is merely a going away party for Paul. So stay with the pure truth. Our biggest battle is to stay with the truth and to keep our hearts pure. We can't be like the Antioch church if the world influences us more and more and more. And it's going to be tough. I'll admit it. It's going to be tough. It will be harder to distinguish good from evil. And I think the devil is doing a good job of. He certainly got the younger generation mixed up. Would you agree? Almost anybody 45 and under, they're a little mixed up about all kinds of things. A lot of them believe capitalism is evil. Well, they got smartphones and they're spoiled by all the capitalist stuff that they've got, yet they believe capitalism is evil. Just wait. You ought to talk to people. I had a few students who lived in East Germany and some other places before the wall went down. And they tell stories of, there were times when, the productivity under communism went down because there's no profit incentive. And they had to live on sugar and mayonnaise. And if they saw something luscious at the grocery store, they lined up to get it with their little, everyone had little cards where you get a quota of something before it was all gone. It was tough. living under communism. Why do you think I asked students, why do you think Stalin put up the Iron Curtain? One student said, it was to keep America from invading Russia. I said, no. What does America want with Russia? Actually, there was a time when America had the only A-bomb in the world and the biggest Navy and Air Force far and away. We could have theoretically, we could have bombed Russia into the Dark Ages. Actually, there were some generals who wanted us to do that, too. That's another story. America actually, were magnanimous in victory. We rebuilt Germany and Japan. And America has no intentions of invading Russia. Stalin put the wall up to keep his own people in. They didn't want that political oppression. They had people spying on each other. You say anything. I may have told you this story before. It's worth mentioning again. One of my students had escaped Vietnam, and after the communists took over, they had a family move in next door to her parent, and they played up to her family just so they could catch her father saying a few bad things about communism. All of a sudden, secret police showed up, and he ended up in one of those gulags for 5 years. They didn't release him, and they finally escaped to Hong Kong. It's a great story of escape. They almost died several times, but they got to America. We're so thankful. The Iron Curtain was put up to keep his people in. Why was the Berlin Wall put up? To keep the ones on the communist side in. They didn't want that horrible thing. But our young people have been so miseducated in colleges and some high schools now, they actually think Marxism's a good thing. Karl Marx was an evil man. You ought to read about his life. He didn't work. He sponged off his relatives. A lot of horrible things you can say about him. Actually, you could, his life story is on YouTube. You can get it. You're going to be shocked at how bad he was. And by the way, what it appears to be the case, as far as I can tell, they're tearing down statues of people like Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Grant, but they're not touching statues of Marx, Karl Marx, or the guy that came up with evolution. They haven't touched their statues. They're like still saints. Is that unbelievable? How badly educated are our young people? The communists have infiltrated the world, and it'll be harder to distinguish good from evil. If you're not for certain kinds of weird sex, you're evil. You're a hater. I'm not making this up. You could say, we want to help people. That's not how they see it. Things are all confused and hazy. We have to resist. Keep our minds and our hearts pure.